started with the note. It had rained all day, a relentless downpour that left everything soggy and gray, so by nightfall I was grateful for the reprieve. The cabin, perched alone at the edge of Pinewood Forest, creaked under the wind as I sat by the fireplace, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. When the knock came at the door, it startled me. It wasn't the kind of place people just visited. At first, I thought it was the storm playing tricks, but when I opened the door, I found it. A small piece of paper pinned to the wood with an old, rusted hunting knife. The handwriting was spidery and uneven, as if scrawled in haste. The truth lies in Pinewood at midnight. That was it. No name, no explanation, no indication of where it came from. I leaned out into the night, scanning the dark tree line for movement. Nothing. Just the wind weaving through the pines, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. A sensible person might have ignored it, might have crumpled the note and tossed it into the fire. But sense isn't something that stays with you when you've spent too many nights alone, with nothing but the creaks of an old cabin and your own thoughts for company. So, I put on my boots and jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped into the forest. The air changed as soon as I crossed the threshold of trees. It always did. There was something about Pinewood that made it feel alive, an old, brooding presence that clung to the edges of your mind like a shadow. Even the birds avoided the place after sundown. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing narrow trails and tangled undergrowth. I hadn't gone far when I noticed the silence. The usual nighttime symphony of chirping crickets and rustling leaves was gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness. I kept walking, the faint crunch of my boots on damp leaves sounding far too loud. Time lost meaning in that silence. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and every tree I passed looked the same as the last. That's when I saw it. The clearing. It appeared out of nowhere, as if the forest had peeled back to reveal its heart. In the center stood a fire pit, the embers faintly glowing despite no sign of a fire in hours. Around it lay a circle of oddities, animal bones, feathers, and a single tattered boot, its leather cracked and blackened. A faint flicker of light caught my eye. In the trees beyond the clearing, small orbs danced in the air, pale and cold like lanterns. They moved with purpose, weaving between the trees in slow, deliberate arcs. I should have turned back, but instead I stepped forward, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. The ghost lights, if that's what they were, moved like whispers made visible, pulling me deeper into the forest. I told myself I was just curious, that I could stop and turn back any time I wanted. But that wasn't true. My feet carried me forward without my permission, my flashlight trembling as I struggled to keep the orbs in view. The trees closed in around me, their skeletal branches arching overhead like a cathedral of the damned. The further I went, the colder it became. It wasn't just the chill of the night. It was a deeper cold, a weight in the air that sank into my bones and made my breath come out in foggy gasps. Then, the whispers began. At first, I thought it was the wind brushing through the pines, but no. It was too deliberate. Low voices, muffled and indistinct, seemed to rise and fall just out of earshot. They were everywhere and nowhere, circling me like predators stalking prey. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking in the dark. The echo swallowed the word whole. The lights flickered, almost as if they heard me. They floated closer now, circling around me in an unholy dance. Up close, they weren't just lights. They were orbs, each one pulsing faintly like something alive. I reached out instinctively, my fingers grazing one before I thought better of it. It felt like frostbite and static, and I snatched my hand back with a hiss. That's when I realized the forest had changed. The path I'd been following was gone, swallowed by the tangled roots and shifting earth. The trees, impossibly gnarled, looked older than anything I'd ever seen, their bark split and oozing something dark. Even the air tasted different, metallic, like rusted iron or old blood. And the silence, it was wrong. My flashlight flickered and went out. I smacked it against my palm, muttering curses under my breath. But it was no use. The light was gone. A low growl cut through the silence, making every hair on my neck stand on end. It wasn't close, not yet. But it was there, somewhere in the darkness, moving toward me. "Who's there?" I whispered, though I didn't want an answer. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the crack of twigs underfoot. I backed away, my heart hammering. The orbs flared brightly and shot into the trees, leaving me alone in the suffocating dark. Then I saw it, emerging from the shadows. A figure, tall and lean, stepped forward with the deliberate grace of a predator. His clothes hung in tatters, his boots caked in mud, and his face was shrouded in darkness. But his eyes, they glowed. Two sickly green orbs, burning like embers, stared at me with an intensity that froze me in place. In his hands he carried a rifle, the barrel twisted and warped as if melted. The figure raised his head slightly, revealing a gaunt, hollow face that seemed barely tethered to life. The Phantom Hunter. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. Instead, I stood frozen as his gaze bored into me. "You don't belong here," he hissed, his voice low and guttural, like the forest itself was speaking through him. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came. Then, without warning, he raised his rifle, not at me, but at the ground. He fired, and the earth beneath my feet erupted, revealing a writhing mass of roots soaked in something black and glistening. The ground trembled, and I stumbled, barely catching myself. That was when I knew. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a forest. It was alive, and it wanted me to stay. The ground beneath me seethed like a living thing. Twisted roots pushed through the soil, slick and writhing as though they had been pulled from some subterranean nightmare. I scrambled backward, my palms slick with sweat and grime, but the roots slithered after me, hungry tendrils reaching for my legs. The Phantom Hunter stood motionless, watching as if deciding my fate. His hollow eyes glowed brighter, casting eerie green light over the cursed clearing. "Please," I croaked, barely able to find my voice. "I didn't mean to come here. I didn't know." His lips barely moved, but I heard his voice clear as thunder. "The forest knows your intent. Speak carefully, wanderer." The roots stopped inches from my boots, curling back like snakes coiling before a strike. My heart pounded as I forced myself to stand, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me like a lead blanket. "I've taken nothing," I stammered. "I swear, I didn't come to harm anything. I just followed the lights." At that, his expression shifted, just slightly. His cracked lips curled into what might have been a sneer or a grimace. He lifted one bony hand and gestured toward the darkened woods behind him. "They led you here," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Fools are always drawn to what they do not understand, and you are no different." I didn't know how to respond. My instincts screamed at me to run, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, shifting and twisting like it was alive. There was no escape, not yet. The Phantom Hunter's rifle lowered, its warped barrel pointing toward the ground once more. He took a step closer, and I caught the stench of decay rolling off him in waves. "If you claim to respect these woods, you will prove it. You will stand trial." I shook my head, fear bubbling into something like anger. "Trial? Trial for what? I didn't ask to be here. The forest called and you answered." His voice grew colder, his eyes narrowing. "Prove your worth, or become one with the roots below." As he spoke, the whispering began again, louder now, echoing all around me. Shapes emerged from the darkness, shadows that moved unnaturally, their forms indistinct but unmistakably wrong. I counted at least half a dozen, maybe more. Ghostly animals stepped into the clearing, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. The largest was a stag, its massive antlers glinting like jagged blades. Its body shimmered as though caught between worlds, patches of its flesh torn and bleeding. Behind it came wolves, foxes, and birds, all mutilated, their spectral forms pulsing with an eerie light. I understood then. This was no trial of words. It was a test of survival. The stag let out a deafening roar, and the shadows surged forward. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted, dodging a swipe from one of the wolves as it lunged at me. My hands found a jagged branch on the ground, and I swung it wildly, striking nothing but air. The whispers turned to laughter, mocking, cruel. I could feel the phantom hunter's gaze on me, cold and unyielding, as the creatures closed in. And then, with a clarity that came from somewhere deep inside, I realized fighting them wasn't enough. If I was going to survive, I had to think like the forest. I had to play by its rules. The stag charged, its antlers gleaming wickedly in the dim green light. I dove to the side, my shoulder slamming into the damp earth. Pain flared, but adrenaline drowned it out as I scrambled to my feet. The wolves circled, their spectral forms flickering like dying embers. The forest wasn't just testing my strength, it was watching my choices, my instincts. Fighting blindly would only get me killed. I remembered what the elder in town had said about Pinewood. The forest respects those who respect it. Take what it offers, and nothing more. I scanned the clearing, searching for something, anything, that might tip the scales. The stag pawed the ground, preparing for another charge. My eyes darted to the fire pit at the center of the clearing. It was surrounded by those odd hunting trophies, the bones, feathers, and tattered boot. One skull in particular, a large buck's, seemed to glint in the dim light. I didn't have time to second guess. As the stag thundered toward me, I sprinted for the fire pit. My fingers closed around the skull just as the stag's antlers swiped past my back, close enough to tear my jacket. The moment I touched the skull, the whispers stopped. The forest fell deathly silent, as if holding its breath. The stag halted abruptly, its glowing eyes locked on me. The wolves, too, froze mid-step, their hollow gazes fixed on the artifact in my hands. I turned it over, feeling the jagged cracks along its surface. Symbols had been carved into the bone, ancient, indecipherable. I lifted the skull high, unsure of what I was doing but desperate for anything that might shift the odds. The phantom hunter's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and commanding. "You dare take what was mine?" His words weren't a question. They were a challenge. His eyes flared brighter, and the ghostly animals growled in unison, their forms rippling like smoke. I held my ground, gripping the skull tighter. "You wanted me to prove my worth. Isn't this what you left behind? Isn't this your legacy?" The hunter hesitated, his twisted form flickering slightly, as though the forest itself was uncertain. The stag let out a low, guttural noise, not a growl, but something closer to a warning. The symbols on the skull began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. I didn't know what would happen next, but I understood one thing. The forest wasn't just testing me anymore. It was listening. I took a slow step forward, raising the skull higher. "I mean no harm," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. "I only want to leave. If I pass your trial, let me go." The phantom tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing. Then he raised his rifle again, not at me but at the sky. He fired, and the shot echoed like thunder. The forest roared in response, the earth trembling beneath my feet. The stag and the wolves lunged, their glowing forms streaking toward me like shadows come to life. There was no time to run, no time to think. All I could do was trust the forest, and whatever strange power pulsed through the skull in my hands. I braced myself as the spectral creatures surged toward me, their hollow eyes gleaming with predatory intent. My fingers tightened around the glowing skull, its carved symbols flaring brighter with every step they took. A wild thought crossed my mind. Was the skull protecting me, or drawing them closer? The stag reached me first. Its massive antlers swept toward my chest, but at the last second, I thrust the skull forward like a shield. A flash of green light burst from its surface, colliding with the stag's spectral form. The creature froze mid-charge, its body trembling as if caught in an unseen force. The wolves howled, their voices blending into an eerie, discordant wail. They lunged as one, their forms flickering in and out of focus like broken film reels. I pivoted, swinging the skull in a wide arc. Another burst of light erupted, driving them back, though the strain was unlike anything I'd ever felt. It was as if the skull drew from my own strength, each pulse of energy leaving me weaker. The phantom hunter stood motionless, his rifle now resting at his side. He watched in silence, his glowing eyes betraying no emotion. I could feel the weight of his judgment pressing down on me like a storm cloud. I stumbled backward, my chest heaving. The creatures regrouped, their movements slower but no less menacing. They were testing me now, circling like wolves cornering wounded prey. I needed a plan. A memory surfaced, an old hunting story my grandfather used to tell. He'd always said that in the wild, survival wasn't about brute force. It was about understanding the rules of the game. Use your surroundings. Work with the land, not against it. My eyes darted to the clearing around me. The fire pit, the twisted roots, the dense canopy overhead. It was all part of the forest's design. The skull hummed faintly in my hands, as if urging me to act. I dropped to one knee, plunging the skull into the soft earth at the fire pit's center. The symbols carved into it flared one final time, sending cracks of green light spidering through the ground. The roots around me writhed, coiling like serpents before shooting toward the ghostly creatures. The stag let out a bellow that shook the air, its massive form dissolving into mist as the roots consumed it. The wolves followed, their howls fading into the night as they were dragged into the earth. The silence that followed was deafening. I rose slowly, my limbs trembling, and turned to face the phantom hunter. He stood as still as a statue, his glowing eyes locked on the skull now buried in the soil. For a moment he seemed less monstrous, less ghostly. Just a man, weary and broken. "You passed," he said finally, his voice heavy with something that might have been sorrow. "The forest accepts you, but it does not forgive." Before I could respond, he raised his rifle once more, this time pointing it skyward. He fired a single shot, and the sound shattered the stillness like a thunderclap. The forest around me shifted. The roots receded, the trees untwisted, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. The phantom hunter stepped back into the shadows, his form fading until only the faint glow of his eyes remained. "Go," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "and do not return." The ghost lights returned, flickering in the distance, this time guiding me toward the edge of the forest. I didn't hesitate. I followed them, my steps unsteady but purposeful, until the trees parted and I emerged into open air. The night was still and quiet, the cabin lights in the distance a welcome sight. But as I crossed the threshold into safety, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching. And somewhere, deep in its heart, the phantom hunter remained, waiting for the next unwelcome visitor.